The speaker is Theo de, how do you pronounce his surname, Nico? Jager?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we'll say Theo de Jager.
Well, thank you, Magda. I think I might
No,
do
it's
it
a
with
bit difficult with
he's president of the World Farmers Organization, and what we're going to be talking to him today about is COVID related, but it's also about the role of agricultural journalists and communicators, and how important we are for farmers to get their message out there, and also as part of this, this advocacy of the industry, talking about how it's going to how it's going to create a sustainable future, so addressing some of the bigger issues. So I'm hoping, I don't know him, but I've watched some of his videos. He looks a really interesting guy, with a lot of depth of knowledge and experience, and although he's from Africa, he's got a very strong African perspective, but also a global perspective. So I think he'll be really fascinating to talk to.
Good morning to all the agricultural journalists of the world. What a real privilege it is to address you again on your conference this year. Strange times we live in. We also have the World Farmers Organization's General Assembly on Friday, digitally for the first time, and it's just not the same. I really wish I had the opportunity to look you in the eye and to touch. The fact is that the world has rapidly changed over the last few months, and nothing will ever be the same again. This is a paradigm shift in the true sense of the word, changing the whole environment in which we operate. I'm also sorry that I cannot do this presentation live, as by accident we have two meetings at the very same time. So I'm quickly recording this, and then I will try to join you, run away from my Vanderpan board meeting a little later, and see if I can engage in a short discussion with you. There are 4 points of departure from which I want to come to you this morning. The first is that COVID is here to stay, and it has changed the way farmers approach the media. Farmers have digitalized, and more than anyone else, because by their very nature they live in the deep rural areas, connectivity is often still a problem. But farmers these days get their news digitally, which also means that in the second place, the world has become a very small place for farmers. In the digitalized world, they take notice of things that happens all over the world, and they compare. And because they are in competition with the best other farmers in the world all the time, they bring us to the third point. Farmers learn more from other farmers than from anyone else. They want to read what other farmers are doing. How are they coping? How are they adapting to change? What are they doing to ensure the profitability and the sustainability of their businesses? And then fourthly, farmers are interested in much more than just the latest developments, the news, the latest technology that is available or global markets. They want to know the so what of the news too. Agricultural journalists are much more than just the news nose in the area, sniffing out what is happening in the world and packaging it for the farmers. Farmers want to know, you guys who spend your lives on listening and looking at what's happening out there. What do you say about it? You are also a translator, translating what's happening in the world into farmers' language. Because he has a gut feeling, or she has a gut feeling out there on the farm on what this means for him or her. But he wants to know, you who are in that business, what do you say? What does this mean? What should he now change? How should he read the news? That so what part, which no university or college can train you in, that only comes through experience. And you know, there's no discount on experience. 20 years of experience as a journalist cost you 20 years. Having said that, can we quickly just touch on the issue of how COVID has impacted on agriculture globally? Remember, COVID did not explode in the rural areas. It exploded in the cities. Not that many farmers are affected by the disease itself. Not that big percentage of farmers fell sick or died. Because by the very nature of our business, we maintain social distancing. We live further apart. We work further apart. That does not mean that we were left untouched, because farmers were severely impacted on the aftermath of this disease. The economic consequences of it. And yes, although the more than half of the world that got into lockdown because of COVID, all exempted their farmers from closing their businesses. Agriculture could go on. It did not mean it was business as usual to the world's farmers. Because our markets were so severely disrupted. The closing of restaurants and canteens at the workplace, and school feeding schemes, and the informal sector, those hawkers on street corners, making hot dogs with French fries, or selling fruit or veggies, or barbecuing some chicken. It meant that a massive part of our markets imploded, and we could not sell into those value chains. In some parts of the world, it caused huge surpluses, and those surpluses were caught up before it left the farm gate. Hence, the millions of liters of milk that was spilled onto fields in the USA. Millions of tons of potatoes that got buried in the eastern parts of Europe, other areas of the world, because the market for French fries imploded. In some areas, it meant huge loss and waste of foodstuffs, at the expense of the producer, of the farmers. Other areas of the world, such as in our own neck of the woods here in southern Africa, farmers actually worked away those surpluses into to emergency food aid, dishing out fruit, veggies, and even meat and milk into communities who simply ran out of food or who could not afford to buy it. In our case here in southern Africa, I can tell you firsthand that the reasoning behind it was actually very simple. Farmers said at the very early stage of the lockdowns that the real dragon is not the virus, it is hunger that will come into our homes on the back of the virus. It's the job losses, the destruction of livelihoods, the lack of an income that caused families to run into a household food security issue. Now, this is important to note. There is enough food in the world, even after lockdown. We can feed every hungry mouth in every family. There is even enough food in Southern Africa, not in every country, but in most of our countries. But the food is not where the people are hungry. And even if it is, they cannot afford to buy it. So the problem is a logistical problem and an affordability problem. And knowing that nothing will stop a hungry man, no fence, no window, door or wall, no international boundary and no sea. The reasoning from the farmers' side and from farmers' organization was people in poor villages will go to the towns because they will believe there is food there. People in shanty towns and squatter camps will go to the cities. People in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Mozambique, food insecure countries, will go to Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, because they believe there is food there. People in Africa will go to Europe, and in Latin America will go to the USA because they believe there is food there. And COVID will cause wave after wave of new migration patterns. And there's only one way to stop a revolution. That's before it happens. Get the food to where the people are hungry. That's the cheapest, no matter what it costs. There's nothing that will stop a hungry man or woman, especially while the children are crying. And as long as they are hungry, we will not sleep. But the fact is that the farmers picked up the bill for that. And our predicament now is that farmers cannot repay the production loans they got from the banks in October, November, December 2019 to put on the shelves in shops now what we need to eat. And because they cannot service their loans, there is no new loans available. And across the globe, farmers are running into a cash flow problem because they cannot access loans. So they are not in place to produce for the new season, and the world will pick up that bill in October, November, December 2020. We are not concerned about global food security today, now, under lockdowns because of COVID. We are concerned about food security in 6 to 12 months from now. If farmers cannot access financing, especially in their lack of capacity to service the previous loans. Hence, in the World Farmers Organization, we are really wrestling at the moment with IFAD, with the World Bank, and with various regional banks, BRICS, the African Bank, to see if we cannot build a bridge over this COVID era. Maybe reschedule the debt, paying it back over a longer term at softer rates. It is by far not business as usual. Farmers want to read the future in your articles. They want to know, how do farmers elsewhere in the world mitigate the conditions which COVID has created? They want to know, what are they doing to ensure the sustainability and the profitability of their businesses on the land? More than anything else, they want to know, how are the markets changing? Because all over the globe, we have seen behavioral changes with consumers. People think differently about food. COVID has taught the world that we can live without most things we never thought we could miss in our lives. But we cannot go without food. There's a new appreciation of the role of farmers, both in society and into the economies, nationally and globally. You see, farmers want to position themselves for the new normal. What should I do differently on my farm to ensure that I still have a place in the economy under new conditions? What else must I do? What must I produce to ensure that I do not land up in the same kind of trouble I was caught in? Because farmers took cognizance of the fact that in the USA and right now in Germany, the meat value chains seem to be severely impacted by the disease itself for some reason. And the implosion of the downstream value chains has an impact on the profitability of every red meat farmer. Which brings us to the hottest topic of our time in agriculture. We are heading at last towards a food system summit organized by the United Nations, probably September next year. And in the run-up to this food system summit, it was quite an issue to ensure that the farmers have a voice, not only in the outcomes of the summit or the deliberations at the summit, but in the planning of the agenda. We made it abundantly clear that we do not want to be invited to dinner. We want to be called to the kitchen. We want to be part of the preparation of the meal. And of course, not all farmers would like what they hear in these deliberations en route to the summit. There's a lot of talk about whether there are still places for farms, where the food should come from farms, where the food cannot just be manufactured in laboratories and factories, where the equality in the world could not be promoted by taking away farms, so that everybody just drink a few tablets and eat a few energy bars every day, ensuring that we have the perfectly balanced diet. There is a heated debate on whether food is really about nutrition. Some of us, and I first raised my hand as one of the biggest champions at the moment for the notion that food is also about culture and social interaction. It's not for nothing that in every religion food plays a major role. It's not for nothing that you invite your friends over to dinner and not just for a discussion on something. You see, the very essence of what we are working with every day is at stake in these deliberations. Just read the Eat Lancet report. Just follow the debates on proteins and whether it is possible to replace animal-based proteins with plant-based proteins, and you will realize that it is about much more than just the future of food. It's about whether the oldest and the biggest profession in the world, farming, still has a future. And no one can be expected to raise the issues of farmers if it's not the farmers themselves, but they need empowerment for that. They need the content of the debates to be translated in farmers' language by you, the farmers' journalists. They need the so what to be dished up for them in a way they can digest it, and in a way which can influence their own opinions of it. You see, because as farmers, we are in the business of life. What we do, producing food, has only one purpose: to sustain life. We work with life every day. Every time you plant a seed in the soil, you work with the essence of life. When we raise our livestock, it's about giving birth and culling again. Like no one else, farmers are in the business of life. And in such a life-changing moment, once in a history experience like COVID's, the question about life on this planet is foremost in our minds. To me, as a farmer, it means only one thing: our time has come. Never in my lifetime or in your lifetimes were farmers more relevant than now, and more under siege than now. And do they have a better opportunity to position themselves for the next few decades than now? And you, those who bring the information to us, play the most vital role in shaping opinions and ultimately policies on that. And that's why it is such a privilege for me to address you today. Really looking forward to slip away from my Vanderpan board meeting and have a discussion with you on it. And once again, I'm so sorry that I have to do this in a pre-recorded way. I would have loved to shake hands rather.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Theo, very, very much. That was such a powerful speech. There was so much in it. I'm Jane Craigie, and I'm in the UK, so we're so pleased that you could join us. Is there anything you'd like to add now that you're here in person?
No, sorry that I could not be in person right from the beginning. I have to go back into the Vanderpan board meeting because I have to take over from the chair. I only have a few minutes. If you will excuse me again, please.
No problem. No problem. Can people email you with some questions if they have some after the event?
Of course. And I will ask Nico from Birik to send you through my email address, and you are more than welcome. But I saw that already some questions have been posted here on the chat function.
Yes.
And can I address them?
Of course you can. That's what I was going to ask you to do. So please, Theo.
The first question which I saw was whether COVID will impact on our ability to feed the global population in 2050, and whether it will impact on the population growth and so. I don't think it's about the volumes of food. We do not really need to produce more food in the world at this stage. The mere fact that food loss and waste is calculated to up to 40% of what leaves the farm gate tells you that there's enough production capacity. The problem is actually in the chain between the farm gate and the consumer's plate. It is less about how much we produce and more about how to deliver what we produce to where it is needed. And clearly also on what exactly we produce. I'm still grappling with the answers to questions about nutrition, you know. Just about every meeting we've had over the last 18 months at the UN or even in the context of the EU, farmers were confronted with our stance on nutrition. And we never thought of it. We just produced the food, and then it had to be distributed by somebody to the consumers. Should we bother as producers about the nutritional value of our food? Can we do something about it? Well, of course, it's got everything to do with what we produce, but exactly what? I also do not have the answer for it. I don't think there will be less people than what we predicted in 2050. I think we will still have a challenge of feeding 2 billion more mouths. But I think the answers will probably come more from how to reduce food loss and waste, especially in the last few steps of the value chain, but even before it leaves the farm gate. And I believe on what we produce, there will be a lot of pressure on us. to ensure that there is value for money in the products we put on the shelves. And here, I want to touch on this very sensitive issue of smallholder farming. You know, all the emphasis in Africa under COVID goes to smallholder farming and the environment in which they need to produce and so. Whilst, you know, you can walk into any chain store, even here in Africa, and very little of what you buy from the shelves in those shops really comes from smallholder farmers. Even that goes directly or in its original format, like fruit or veggies, it comes from farms that can maintain the standards which the consumers want. And that which goes via processing plants is usually also from your larger and medium scale commercial farms. Smallholder farms work into the short value chains directly to the street corner or the neighbor's kitchen or to the local town's market, and is not feeding the cities. We need to rethink this over the way we emphasize the plight of the smallholder farmer. And by that, I'm not saying that we should not take care of the smallest and the poorest. But the global food security which we enjoy now is not anchored in smallholder farming. It is in the commercial side, those farmers who run businesses from the land. There was also a question about investments. Should what we've learned from COVID impact on the way we think about investment in agriculture? Should one invest in more capacity to produce, or rather how to get the food to where people need it and where they are hungry? Well, my gut feeling is that in the next 5 years, if it is so long, we will really see an explosion of digital technology on farms. And just like we have all probably forgot how we farmed without mobile phones, in 5 years from now, we would have forgotten how we worked without data. Data will become the very air we breathe on farms. Precision farming will take over. You cannot compete against it. Data is the precision part of precision farming. And with ever cheaper sensors and ever higher integrity in data, whether it is biological data, geographical data, satellite and drone-based data, or whether it is inactive data, data that's generated by machines, that comes from robots or through artificial intelligence, data will be the new gold in agriculture. And everybody is going to embark on a gold rush. We as farmers, we can only hope that we will have the opportunity to open the shops selling the spades while everybody wants to mine the data. And in the best scenario, we hope to have a stake in our own data, not to lose our grip on our own data. But I think if I was an investor and my livelihood depended on where I put my money in the next 5 years in agriculture, I would have invested in the digitalization of the production systems and the value chains in agriculture. I cannot see any more questions. Are there more?
Yep, there's one from me actually, Theo, which is, you talked about the Food System Summit, which I know has been raised a number of times in the news globally, because it's focused people's minds. What role do you think we as agricultural journalists and communicators can play in preparing and sharing our voice and the news to the wider publics ahead of that summit?
We are really bargaining on you to open up the debates, the global debates on food systems. It is very interesting to see how the different interests are positioning themselves in the run-up to the summit. The smallholder groups in mainly Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, which have a totally different approach. You will see they also protest against how the summit is being organized and who's been appointed to organize it and that kind of stuff. There are the large conglomerates, the multinational companies, Unilever, Danone, Nestle, Crooks Brothers, who are very vocal in the debates on processed proteins, plant-based proteins, replacing red meat, even talking about the farm-free world, or a world without farms. There's a very interesting documentary on YouTube on a world without farms, as if it is the answer to all our climate questions too, biodiversity questions, health questions. Then there is the United Nations and its agencies itself, especially IFAD, FAO, who's got strong positions on how they think our food systems should change, with more emphasis on organic production and nature agriculture, natuurboerdery, more friendly towards the environment and the climate. And then there are our own voices from organized agriculture. And we will probably have a very interesting debate on Friday with our own General Assembly, where we need to take a position. I'm pushing very hard to have a formal farmers' position more than a year before the summit, so that we can table our interests. But you know, we are farming on different planets. You cannot really compare the farming systems in Europe with that in Africa, or those in Southeast Asia with those in North America. And there are no simple answers to these complicated questions. There's no one size fits all. We need to find middle ground and consensus. And at least the farmers have, with one voice or unanimously recognized that if we do not find consensus, we will not have policy. And we cannot influence global policy if we do not have policy ourselves. So I want you all to hold your thumbs that we will come up with a common position on that, because it always also impacts on the global trade dispensation, the issues about level playing fields. It also impacts on intellectual property rights, and on the digitalization of agriculture, especially in the global south. And all of that matters in changing global food systems. If you would ask me what my wish is, or the fairy lands on my shoulder and give me one or two wishes for the outcome of the Food System Summit, I would wish for a fairer distribution of risk and profit. I think in our current system, the primary producer carries too much risk and share too little in the profit of food where it is ultimately traded. And secondly, I would wish for a trade dispensation globally that ensures that there is a place for the smallest and the poorest. Because if we can take care of the weakest primary producer, all the others' interests would also be covered. So we are fighting very hard under the banner of the Decade for Family Farmers that the world should bend backwards to ensure that there will always be space for the family farmer.
Yeah, such an important point. Theo, have you got any time? We've got some more questions have come through, or do you need to go?
Let's take another question or two.
Okay, so from Lindy in South Africa, are there any regions you have identified as being vulnerable to food riots as a result of COVID?
Oh yes, the regions where there is a problem with household food security. even if there is national food security in a country, if there is not household food security, we are bound to see riots. What else should families do when they run out of food? Lindy will know here in South Africa, it is quite an issue. But we have more institutions trying to address it. We are actually fortunate because we are in a food surplus situation. It's a issue of moving the food to where it is needed. But there are some countries, Zimbabwe, certain areas of Mozambique, certain areas of Tanzania, and then Congo DR. There are areas in Latin America, in Argentina, Brazil, and then especially in the northern parts of South America, where household food security and even regional food security is an issue. And we expect migration because of that. We are really wrestling with the Rome-based agencies to see if they cannot invest in a mechanism to do the distribution of food. It's very often more expensive to transport the food than what it is to buy the food. And we need to solve that. But in Southern Africa, or in Africa south of the Sahara, we have just discussed this morning in the Vanderpan board meeting, which I've just left, that we can do no more important investment at this stage than to address the hunger issue.
Thank you, Theo. And a question from Johnny in the Philippines. How is the ongoing geopolitical conditions affecting agricultural productivity? If indeed, if indeed food production and security is paramount in controlling COVID?
Sorry?
How is the ongoing geopolitical conditions affecting agricultural productivity, if indeed food production and security is paramount in controlling COVID?
You know, every farmer is every day in competition with the best other farmers in the world because the world became so small. And competitiveness is everything. Competitiveness is in farmers' terms the ability to put the preferred product on the shelf. And preference is dictated by price in the poorer areas, by nutritional value in your middle income areas, and in traceability in your affluent areas, where they also want to know how was this pig treated before it was slaughtered, and that kind of stuff. Now, the unstable areas is the biggest part of the global market, and that is where there is food insecurity. Now, that is unfortunately also the areas in the world where productivity is at its lowest, because people still produce with hand hoes and ox-driven implements. Whilst in the more affluent areas, technology brought about a new paradigm in productivity too. We need, in a new paradigm of global agriculture, we need to get a more equal distribution of technology. Technology will enhance productivity. And it is possible. You know, in Japan, a small island with very little resources, which was destroyed in the Second World War, the old Kaiser Chowa at the time formulated a dream for Japan. He did not say, the United States did this to us, they now owe us, they must come and help us. He sold a dream to the Japanese. He said, let's work towards a dispensation in the world where no one can afford not to do business with us. And this happened in the 1970s when we were children. You could buy anything at a shop made in Japan, but it was associated with low quality, low technology, and it was cheap. And then they rebranded made in Japan to high tech, trustworthy, expensive stuff. And look where Japan is today in terms of global wealth. Whom of you would have believed it if anybody told you in the 1980s that China would today play such a dominant role in the global economy? Something magnificent happened in Japan and in China in about 30 years. Now, is that possible in Africa and Latin America? I believe it with every cell in my body, through agriculture. If we can leapfrog the way we have leapfrogged in communications technology, in Africa, it was literally from the drum to the smartphone over about 30 years. Can you imagine if we can do the same technological leapfrogging from the hand hoe to precision farming and robotics and artificial intelligence and data-driven production? We can solve much of the world's primary problem, which is poverty and hunger.
It's about leadership, vision, and communication, isn't it, Theo?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've got, I think probably you need to go, and I noticed a few people are leaving the call, but one last question from Elaine, and then we'll share your contact details. So Elaine's from the US. COVID-19 has shown the vulnerability of supply chains in places like the US with dairy, beef, and hogs. Do you think we will see changes in what we do with supply chains in the next 5 years because of this, and what?
I believe so. If I listen to our colleagues, the NFU in the USA, Farm Bureau, the Deutsche Bauernverband now in Germany, where it also happened, and I think three things will happen in the next 5 years. The first is we will see more pressure on centralization or concentration of power in the downstream value chain. Less of these mighty multinational conglomerates and more in the hands of producers too. I think farmers will wrestle for a better stake in the value chain, more shares in the value chain, a rediscovery of the role of cooperatives, where a single farmer cannot necessarily afford to get involved in the value add in the downstream, but a group of farmers can. I think we will see a lot more sharing of the soft technology, the business kind of technology. How are you guys doing it in Denmark? And what can we learn from that in East Africa? How did you get about to ensure that you have a better stake? How can we do it around here? And I think the demand from the consumers, that force that is pulling the value chain, the market itself, it's going to force us to take more responsibility in terms of traceability and standards. I know in the UK, it's a big issue. I see the NFU in the UK is actually no longer the victim in this debate. They are leading the debate towards better traceability and transparency in the chain. But it is one of the very few farmers' voices that is doing that. For the rest, I think the farmers taking responsibility for what reaches the plate of the consumer, that will be the big paradigm shift for us.
Yeah, and one of just on that point, Theo, one of the points that was widely debated before you came onto the call was that the mainstream media is increasingly looking at us as a community, including you and your organization, to give insight and to demonstrate leadership in our own sense about what that future might look like. So it's an opportunity for us, and often, journalists they report and don't necessarily take a lead on their own views. But I think now's a time when perhaps that should be put aside, and that we all do demonstrate some leadership if we want a positive future to emerge from this crisis. And
it is important that we team up between primary producers and agricultural journalists and strategize on what is the message we want to take out there. Exactly what do we want the consumers to hear, and how do we want them to hear it?
Yeah, that's so true. That sounds to me like a follow-up call at some point.
I would love that.
Well, thank you ever so much, Theo, for making the time to record the video. We're going to put that on the IFAJ website. Yeah, so we really appreciate you taking the time for us, and for everything that you've said. It's just been mind-blowing to hear you.
It was such a privilege. You know how close the agricultural journalists are to my heart, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this discussion with you. May you really have a blessed conference, and may you come out of this ever so much stronger.
Thank you, Theo, and many thanks for your time.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Minutes. I thought what we might do is just look at how COVID has affected everybody in terms of doing their day job, because I think it will give us some useful context to talk to Theo about when he joins the call, and also how we think it'll unfold as we go forward, and also how people have practically been dealing with it, and whether there's anything we can learn from each other about how do you keep your day job going when you can't physically get out, and part of the richness of farming storytelling about farming is actually getting out, meeting the farmer, and seeing where he or she farms and the business itself. There's a lot that we pick up from being there. So how do we overcome that learning and the story that we pick up just by viewing what we see. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we'll start. Hugh, out of interest, Hugh and Mikke, how many people joined yesterday?
Yesterday there was 51.
Great.
And we have 152 registered for this meeting.
That's brilliant.
Well, yes, but I think people sign up for the whole week, but they don't have then they pick and choose. You know what it's like. Oh, I'll go to that one, and then you get busy and you forget about it, or you have to go to a meeting. But anyway, we're ticking up. We have over 200 now registered for the week, different people.
Brilliant. That's really good. I think we'll make a start. First of all, I thought what I would ask. So we've got a different range of people, and a different range of roles by all of us on the call today. So we've got some journalists, we've got some communicators, we've got countries that have fared differently during lockdown. Some countries, agricultural journalists have been allowed out, and some of them haven't. So I thought what I'd start with doing is perhaps to start with somebody who is working in a freelance capacity, because I think that has been very difficult for freelancers to, where publishers and businesses are reducing their spend during COVID. Freelancers have had to be even more, I suppose, ingenious in how they go about A, winning the work, and B, getting the stories done. So Chris, I was going to ask you and Steve Werblow if you could perhaps talk us through how COVID-19's affected you doing your job and earning your living. Chris McCulloch and Steve Werblow. Sorry, Chris, to put you on the spot.
No problem. I can start if you like.
That'd be great.
Yeah, it's been quite a challenging 4 months, but if you persevere, find the niche that of publications or editors that are still operating, it's still possible to do your job. Okay, to a lesser extent, But I've been working throughout the last 4 months, mostly from home, I have to say, but I have got out time again. The last flight was in February to Highlands of Scotland. But by working, having a good connection of people overseas, is still possible to get the stories done, get the interviews done. Pictures is the big issue. If you can't get pictures from overseas, that's a problem, because and not everybody is lined up or geared up to get you a good picture. I've been quite fortunate that I have got decent pictures most of the time. Takes a wee bit of perseverance, wee bit of pleading, but eventually you get there. And things are starting to pick up again now. I have to say I've been working in both print and online media. There's been no restrictions on which one is still operating. And it's things, I'm getting emails now from editors who are off furlough and coming back into production again. So yeah, business is down, but it's not out and it's starting to pick up again. We have lost all of the main trade events and shows that I would normally report on this year. There's one in October still left. I'm hopeful that it's going to go ahead, but it looks like next year is going to be crazy busy. If we're allowed to fly, if we're allowed to get into certain countries like Germany, France, for example, if there's no second waves. Germany at the moment is looking like there's a second wave coming from abattoirs. 1,000 workers are all infected, so to speak. And Victoria in Australia is looking like it could have a second wave as well. So you just don't know where we're going to be in 3 to 4 months. But I just keep niggling away, keep the stories coming, and working ahead of myself stories for the next 5-6 weeks. So from my point of view, it hasn't been too bad, but you got to have a bit of true grit to keep going.
Yeah, and Chris, what are you seeing in terms of what journalists, so what commissioning editors are interested in? What are you seeing? Is it still COVID related, or are some of them saying, just I've had enough, I want to look at some other things, get back to business as usual in terms of content?
Yeah, obviously at the start there was a lot of, how does COVID affect this? How does it affect that? What are you going to do? Are you worried? Blah, blah, blah. But now it's more like we have to be still aware of it and how it can affect export, import markets, how it can affect prices, how it can affect people still in jobs. But they're more so looking kind of beyond the COVID era and trying to, which seasons and which countries are going to be in August, September, October. How do we get articles suitable for that season at that time, whether it's COVID related or not? But they still are keeping it in the background. But I'm doing a lot more farm stories now, like how are people getting on today without going into too much detail about COVID. A lot of technical stories as well in terms of seasons, like grazing seasons, feeding seasons, selling seasons. The machinery manufacturers and dealers are coming on board now, saying, look, we're going to be open for business in July. We need to get the message out, what we're selling, what we're doing. There's no trade shows. So the media, I think the media has got a huge opportunity here to help the agriculture industry steer it out of this pandemic disaster, whatever we want to call it. And for us as journalists, especially as freelance journalists, I think there's a good opportunity to help them do that.
And Chris, in terms of you doing your job from home, what have been the most important things that have kept you active and kept you writing and kept you earning?
Gin. I would say I've went through 2 bottles of gin in this COVID era, and there's a third on the way. But seriously though, a good broadband connection is vital. Of course, here we are in another Zoom meeting. I nearly was going to say I'm sick of Zoom meetings, but it's essential to run your business. You need a good broadband connection. You need patience, which I don't have, but you got to use what you got, your skills you got. You got to be sweet with those who you're interviewing and have patience with them, because they know and it's a different circumstances to carry out an interview. Perhaps they don't have time. They don't social distancing. I mean, I've been out interview in Northern Ireland, and the social distancing is effective. But when you're on a farm, it's quite easy to, keep your distance. But yeah, a good broadband connection, a bit of patience, finding the right person for the story that you've got is also essential. I mean, I don't know how many contacts I have, but finding the right person for the right story at the time that the editor wants it is also important. And I've also noticed some of the farmers and people I've been interviewing, their mental health, although they keep saying there's nothing wrong with my mental health, I'm fighting it, I'm all this, I'm all that. But when you chat to them for a while or notice their social media posts, you do see that they are different to what they used to be. And from the outside in, from looking at their social media or talking to them, it's quite important. You can't say, are you all right? But you can just talk to them and then talk to them again in a couple of weeks' time and keep doing that, just to keep them that someone else is out there, because there are some farmers saying, I haven't spoke to anybody in 2 to 3 weeks. It's, what do we do? But yeah, that's where I'm at the minute. That's how we go.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay.
And Steve, or anybody else who's working freelance, have you got anything to add there about, what have been the most important things to keeping you going? What have editors been interested in, or broadcasters been interested in? And how, and also, I suppose, that moving the story on a bit, or the conversation on a bit, what opportunities do you think there are for agricultural journalists and communicators after this? So the first one, what 3 things have kept any freelancers going during this?
This is Steve. So here in the States, I've worked with the furrow, and so our lead times are so long that we've had the luxury, basically, of not having to be out constantly to make deadline or to generate copies. So, in fact, I'm about to go this week on my very first field trip since the pandemic, started our shelter in place or our lockdowns in March. So that's that'll be a new experience for me as far as seeing how we maintain social distance and that kind of thing. What I did find was that, looking ahead to, the next several months or years worth of stories, I've tried to zero in on articles where I knew I could draw deeply on my photo library if needed, because we just didn't know what the travel prospects were. And in a country as large as ours, with the need to fly to a lot of the destinations, it's still something of a question mark. So I'll take my first flight next month, which will be an adventure, I'm sure. So from that perspective, I'm trying to aim for that sweet spot between sort of the first wave and the second, in case we end up with another set of shutdowns or lockdowns in the autumn or coming into winter. So I'm going to try to pick up a lot of the photography that I need through August into September, October, in hopes to fill those gaps for the work that I need to do. But I'd love to hear from somebody who has, like Chris does, tighter, immediate deadlines. As far as the communications work, that's been going pretty much the same, and most of that is desk bound, so it's not as compelling or not as necessary for me to be out in the field for those. But again, it's starting to get to that point where we need to get out, and I'll just have to see what happens as far as the feel of it or the mechanics of it.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Steve. That touches on another thing, which is the budget that commissioners have, whether that's a private client, a public client, or a commercial client, as well as the publishers and broadcasters themselves, so the media world. I know Lee put a message on the chat. Lee, would you like to add some comment, now that you are both, you are still a journalist and also a freelancer?
Yes, indeed, and greetings to everyone from down under. Great to join you through this forum on this particular medium, and it is a wonderful thing that we can now actually connect in this way. I think it's revolutionised so many things in such a short period of time. Look, down here in Australia, it's I think it's an interesting situation. It's probably a little bit different to some parts of the world because we kind of went hard and went early with restrictions and lockdown here, and it seems to have largely worked, although there is, as Chris mentioned earlier, a little bit of a resurgence happening in Victoria, but albeit in terms of a handful of numbers, not scores or hundreds or thousands like there are in other countries. So we're pretty lucky, but I think a fair bit of the media has continued largely as per normal, albeit with the restrictions that there are on travel and being able to get out and see people face to face. But from my perspective, as a freelancer these days, my brother and I run a podcasting company here. And in actual fact, this has been the best thing ever for us. It's kind of, the work is just materialising because conferences are being cancelled, events are being called off. People are clearly really hungry for good information and communication, and therefore podcasting is kind of coming into its own a little bit, and we've just got work coming from all directions at the moment, whether it be from agricultural departments in different states of Australia or through to things interestingly like mental health. We've now produced a number of series of podcasts on mental health here for rural Australia because it is such a big issue normally anyway, with all of the things that people in rural Australia have to deal with, the long-term droughts we've been suffering, other natural disasters like bushfire, etc. And now this COVID-19 situation, which just adds a whole new layer of complexity to things, really has increased demand for these sorts of services. So it is a mixed bag, and it's an extraordinary period of time, I've got to say.
Yeah, I agree, Lee. That's really interesting. I think certainly there's been opportunities created for people during this, and it's been so important to be adaptive and to be creative, hasn't it, about looking for those opportunities. And I've heard some people say that it's made them more hungry, because they've had to go out and seek new opportunities. I was wondering if I could ask somebody from a publication that's still strong and is still trying to do its day job from home or with restrictions on where and how they work. And I wondered if maybe Lindy and Nico from South Africa, if you could tell us a little bit about what's been happening with Farmers Weekly with you. No? Lindy?
Yes, I'm here. So I'm just going to, I was waiting for Nico, but I'll jump in. I'm not full-time by Farmers Weekly. I do freelance for them, but it has been quite an unfortunate situation with the holding company that owns Farmers Weekly, in that they had decided during the lockdown to actually shut down their magazine division completely. So out of the handful of publications they have, mostly aimed at mainstream women or female audiences, they've closed down all of them. And Farmers Weekly is the only one out of that whole stable which has survived, which is still profitable. So it seems to me it's been a bit of a blessing in disguise, because the magazine, which is a weekly, has now shifted over to the company's newspaper division, which in my opinion is a bit more geared to deal with something like a weekly that's a bit more fast moving than a monthly magazine. The company that runs the newspapers has also got a massive community newspaper network in South Africa, and Farmers Weekly is now also going to be tapping into that network to get more rural stories that are spread out more across the country. So, we've seen that in a lot of industries with COVID, where you just faced this absolute doom and gloom situation, and then suddenly the silver lining appears, and people find that they're actually better off. So we're grateful for that with regards to Farmers Weekly. It is the only English mainstream farming publication in South Africa. So I certainly believe it's still got a place in the market, even though there is this narrative about print that is dwindling. And there's a lot of advertising spend going around with regards to agriculture as well. And we're also seeing, as Chris mentioned, with he made such an important point. He made it on Facebook the other day as well, about the media that's got such a big role to play now, because there are no trade shows happening. There's none of these conferences where people would usually congregate to get the information, and the place to get it now is media. And I think the media have got such a pivotal role to play now. And in terms of driving advertising sales in the economy that we're in, where everybody's a bit strapped for cash, the budget that they would have spent on those expos could very well now be pumped into publications, and partnering with publications to get the information out that they would have gotten out at the trade shows. And we're seeing John Deere is one company that's doing that here by us. And we have, so we've seen good responses from a company like that, who is innovating in that regard and using the opportunity.
Thank you, Lindy. That's really interesting and some really important points there. I wonder, I know Chris has got another comment, but I wonder whether, Chris, I'll come back to you in a minute. Cecile, if you can hear me, I know that you're involved with space, so that's come up a couple of times already in the conversation, the loss of our shows and events, and what an impact that's had for both agricultural journalists getting content, but also importantly, Lindy's just brought up that point about the market. So, the industry actually accessing the information that it needs. Can you talk us through your what's happened with you, and also your thoughts about the impact of it, but also what might happen going forward?
Yes, so we had to cancel this year SPAS 2020, which would have taken place in September. It was a really difficult decision for us, and but we are trying to be a relay this year again for the agricultural world. So we are organizing a lot of services, which will take place in September in dates of SPAS. For example, we will maintain online conference. We will organize. We are now preparing a mobile application which people will be able to download and book for a meeting between the exhibitors. We will diffuse the exhibitors list. We are thinking also about organizing farm visits, online farm visits, and leave journalists or visitors to talk with the farmers after the virtual visits. We are thinking about a big program to still be a relay in this agricultural world. We also will maintain the Enough Space operation and organize a moment to to offer the prizes to the winner about innovative products and services or equipment. The prize winners will be announced on 15 September on our website. We're thinking about a physical moment, but for the moment we don't know exactly. So in order to to diffuse the information and to let you know, inform people about the companies are still working now. Farmers also are still working now, and we want to organize a moment to thank all the farmers who also work on hardly during this quarantine time, and we still want to be a relay. So, well, if you're interested also, because as people say before, you are hungry about information, so do not hesitate to send me an email. I will put the details to get all the list of the activities we will maintain. And if you also require something from shows organizers such as PASS, do not hesitate to let us know. If we can organize something who could help you to be better informed, then do not hesitate to tell me. We will also use the social media network to diffuse the information also. And well, we hope we will be able to open physically next year in September.
Thank you, Cecile. That's really interesting. Chris, you had a point that you wanted to raise.
Yeah, I forgot to say that you were asking about which media was still going ahead, but I noticed there was a resurgence in interest of agricultural happenings from the daily medias as well. And I was working for things like the Daily Mail, Belfast Telegraph and such likes, who were wanting stories about how farmers were feeding the populations and the efforts they were going to maintain social distancing and all the rest. Now, the big stories here were that farmers and food outlets started deliveries from their farms direct to consumers wherever they be in residential areas. And this is something that the daily media picked up on and wanted in-depth coverage and personal stories with some of those farmers who were out 6 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night delivering food. And that connected more consumers to farmers via the daily media. It's not often the daily media takes a good positive interest in farming, but this time they did, and that has continued and still one of my outlets to some of the daily media who want to know about this and want to know how, what farmers are doing. We've lost all our open farm weekend event here that connected consumers to the farmers. Well, it's now been done virtually as well. But just want to say that it's nice to see the daily media taking an interest in doing something positive for once. Although they do still sensationalize your headline, the story is still the same, but I still get paid, so that's the main thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chris. Has anybody else seen that? An increase in the non-farming media wanting stories from farming journalists?
Yeah, if I can jump in, I've used my privilege, Jane. It's been the same thing here, or at least it's been my experience. And I've noticed in a couple of the daily newspapers, at least a story a day. Now, it's always about what's wrong, migrant workers getting sick and things like that. But there's been some more in-depth coverage as well. And just of a personal note, my daughter and her husband run an agritourism farm, so they sell everything direct to consumers. So even in the off-season wintertime, they have wagon rides and they have maple syrup tastings and Easter egg hunts and those kinds of things to keep staff busy and generate income in the off-season. So they lost about $100,000 in March, April period from activities that they would usually run, charging people to come out to the farm. So they switched, expanded their bakery to a complete store and went online. And the interesting thing was that they more than made up that $100,000 in sales to people who wanted to buy things a local nature. And the summer season has only just started here with farmers markets. And in the first month, sales are up at least 50, 60%. And a couple of markets have been record for that date over the last decade. And it's very interesting that people are showing up to buy local food. The tourist aspect, of course, has disappeared. There's no music and hanging around. So the buyers who come to the market are mostly those who were there just to buy food. And probably, I think, the most important thing is that people are using plastic instead of cash. Farmers markets typically were 95% cash and 5% debit or credit cards. Now they're 50 or 60% debit or credit cards because people don't want to handle the money. And the interesting thing is that before they'd have $20 and they go, oh, well, I'll have some asparagus, some strawberries and a pie. And now they're going, oh, look, you've got muffins. Hey, you've got some apple juice. And so they're spending a lot more because they can. And so sales are up at the farmers markets. And that's true for a number of markets that I've spoken to where people have been working. So as much as there are some restrictions and some downsides, there's always little bits of upsides on the other scale. And it's been quite surprising how that has shifted in a very short period of time.
Thank you, Hugh. Sam, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just following on from what Hugh said, we had a similar thing here in Australia where before Christmas, I mean, obviously, as everyone knows, we've been in drought. Then we had really horrific bushfires that wiped out a lot of farmland. But we had a campaign, a social media campaign called Buy from the Bush. And in that campaign, regional businesses and rural businesses and farmers could promote themselves on this social media campaign. And that has also helped in COVID because people have been able to go online and be able to help these regional and rural communities who have suffered, as I said, not just COVID, but bushfires and drought. So that's been a really good campaign for where farmers can go and sell their wares and utilise that. And also accommodation farm stays, which is, they've got a separate one for that. It's called Stay in the Bush. But just as an aside from that and how we've used our readers and community with photos, Chris was touched on that before. We've actually utilised our readers to help us get the photos because we haven't been able to go out and farm. So they've become sort of our captured audience where they go out and they take the photos, and we've really been able to utilise them really well. And they've like thrown themselves behind that to help put pictures to our stories. And we've been overwhelmed by that. We actually started a hashtag View from the Land, which also got a lot of traction, and we were able to showcase galleries because, you know, like everyone said, we haven't been able to go out to shows or events or country fairs. So they've been our eyes on the ground and capturing. So it's been a really nice relationship that we've built with our readers photographically.
I think just to add from a UK perspective, but not just from a UK perspective solely, but in the UK we've had the same thing. So I was called by the BBC the other day. The Panorama, which is our leading investigative national programs, run weekly. They've run all sorts of stories like poisoning Russian agents and, you know, all sorts of different, a wide array of topics. And one of the things they want to look at, and there's a journalist researching it at the moment, it's the pains, the anguish and the aftermath of COVID for the food supply system. So that they've taken an interest in hearing from an agriculturalist, and I'm not a journalist, I'm a communicator, but that was spurred on by the series of films that Prue Adams has been doing, which have included a number of people on this call, where she has been asking, you know, what's been the impact of COVID-19, but also what do you see as the opportunities and the aftermath? And I think, you know, it's really timely for us to have this discussion because, as Chris said, you know, there is an opportunity for us to take some leadership with farmers to help them out of this crisis. But there's also an opportunity for us in what we've been hearing just now to take some leadership out with our industry as well. You know, we see a lot about food supply and food supply systems, and we see their vulnerabilities, and it almost feels like there's a really strong opportunity for us with our knowledge of the land and how food is produced and how it's distributed, to have a real say in the future. And I wonder if I could pull in, we haven't heard much from the Far East, and I know we've got Fermin Diaz and also Albert, so Fermin from the Philippines and Albert, and then we've got Yukiko from Japan. Whether you could give us an insight to what's been happening in your countries. Or anybody else from the Far East.
Okay. Can I say something?
Yes, Michael.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Well, we've had cases of, you would say, the pandemic somehow has disrupted supply chain flows, flow of goods, and affected from the producer side, the farmers, all the way to logistics, warehousing, trucking, all the way to retailers. So we've had cases of farmers ending up with bounty harvest. Let's say, for instance, tomatoes, they ended up dumping them because of no ready markets, because trucks could not move freely, you know. But so indeed, while there's a need, while there are pockets of gluts because of the effects of the lockdowns, there is now a rethinking. Do you think there should be a rethinking as well towards all this just-in-time management system where you only produce on demand? Because the recurring threats of calamities, more in our part of the world, and emergencies or crises like epidemics, in effect, compels countries to also stockpile, not only just to produce just in time for demand, but to produce, to prepare for emergencies and like crisis situations like this case, like the pandemic. So so in effect, it's affecting the global, should we say, the structures of global production and trade patterns, no? Which will, on the one hand, it will also encourage or emphasize the importance of agriculture production globally, no? Like, and because also of the disruption, the global trade, people are now hesitant to trade with each other. You're also emphasizing there's also a growing need to not really to go back to autarkic type of production, but to emphasize local production, local development in industries and that sort. You know? So whether this is in industrial countries or less developed countries. So in effect, to what extent will this affect trade? But while at the same time also encourage production. So there are a lot of things to be written about or analyze, or to see trends, how this gonna take its proceed, no? As we move forward beyond the post-pandemic stage.
That's
so
really
what do you
interesting.
think? Yeah.
Yeah, and Michael, what do you do? What's your job?
Yeah, I used to be a full-time journalist. I've covered agriculture most of my, but right now I'm still with the Philippine Agriculture Journalists, where Fermin Diaz is now our president. I write occasionally for some papers, But right now, I'm involved in organizing basic sector cooperatives for basic sectors like transport, jeepneys, tricycles, the basic sectors. Because there are also opportunities for the basic sector, but they just don't have they're not articulate enough to organize among themselves or access many of the programs available to them. So I see the opportunity as well, and the challenge of the role of professionals in partnering with basic sectors. And I think this is happening in many countries, developed countries, like even in Europe, no? Like France, for example, like Crédit Agricole, so biggest bank owned by farmers, no? There's partnership of professionals or in Asia, like for instance, South Korea, the farmers till their farm and work in their factories, which are run by graduates of universities who know marketing, finance, and management. So that's what we need on a mass scale. I mean, by the thousands of professionals working with the poor. But in this country, in the Philippines, the graduates of our universities, they grow abroad. So there's a massive brain drain. In fact, there are almost 12 million Filipinos who have migrated abroad or are working currently in all over the world, no? And or they join local companies. But the few that are left working with the poor, they're either in politicized, working with the left, working in environmental stuff, but very less into business development, project development, livelihood development for the poor. And if you study how many of our big businesses, the oligarchs of this country, many of them are actually even high school graduates. So many of the Taipans, Chinese tycoons, no, Filipino Chinese tycoons, but the people running their businesses are professionals who are graduates from even Ivy Leagues of the US, London School of Economics, and locally the top big schools. And so they're the ones who are creating the surplus for this business. But very few professionals working with the poor. So I think this is an opportunity with what has happened with the pandemic. Everyone has been wiped out. I mean, somehow there's been a leveling. So there's a opportunity to shift, instead to shift from because the initial effort of the pandemic is relief. Those who were displaced, you give dole-outs, consumptive expenditures, you know, but you need to shift and upgrade now to more productive, so to get the economy going. So shift back to production, you know, industry, that stuff, but this time involving the poor. So, and I guess it would be a challenge for journalists and writers to be in the forefront in the advocacy. So, and I'm talking, I'm also walking my talk in the sense that I'm now doing what I've been preaching. No? So that's why I've shifted from writing as a profession to actual cooperative organizing with the poor. So that's my advocacy now.
Oh, it's fascinating, Michael. Thank you. That's a really interesting insight into what's happening. You know, the ownership in the Philippines, who's running Filipino agriculture, what's happening with your talent and how you're losing that. That's a really, really interesting insight to your country. And you're an important country agriculturally, very important.
Yeah.
There was a couple of points. I'm going to go to Abbas first. You raised a really key point, which links to what Michael has just said, which is you know, investment into agriculture, and this is going to be a key area potentially for agricultural journalists to comment on, because it requires knowledge. So anybody who's investing in agriculture needs to have knowledge about the sector. Abbas, do you want to expand on your point that you raised in the chat? No. Lisa, you had a comment about connectivity and the cost of data in South Africa. Oh, sorry, Abbas, you're here. I think you're on mute. Oh, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
COVID-19.
Can hear you now.
I wanted to comment on the post-COVID-19. That after the COVID-19, it holds much potential for agricultural investments in Africa, in Ghana as well. So there is a need for us as agricultural communicators or journalists to write stories about where there are resources available that interested investors can invest in to boost up our declining production in the world. Because you just had a comment from Lisa saying most farmers are finding it difficult to get information to things that they need. So it is high time that as the communicators, we use our medium to project opportunities that are existing now and those that will exist after the COVID-19, God willing, if it is over. So this is an opportunity for us to use that to extend these opportunities to push up for the potential investors. And mostly we write about stories affecting farmers and their communities. But we also have to take it as a point to let the world know the potentials that are available in rural areas or potentials that are there that people too can invest in for farmers to gain much from whatever that they are doing. So that's why I comment that post-COVID-19 holds a potential for us in the agri sector, and then it dawns on us, the communicators, to start writing about, letting the world know what it holds for the farmers. So it's very nice that I think agri communicators, we just have to turn from our communication model now, writing stories about farmers and the problems that they encounter. We should also direct our effort towards writing stories about opportunities that exist in the rural areas that people too can invest in. Yeah.
That's a really, really important point. So we could almost, as a community, we could almost be part of creating opportunity for agriculture, which touches a little bit on what Chris said about, you know, it's also about giving technical expertise to farmers and news on how things are going to change and what response farmers can make. But it's also about encouraging inward investment to agriculture, and in some countries more than others, that's going to be a massive opportunity. So in Ghana, how do you think that will affect you if you had more inward investment from companies interested in farming and food in your country?
Yeah. Now we're writing about places that fertile lands are available that have not been put to use now, that communities are ready to release them to interested investors that want to invest. So I think this is a clear opportunity that we started projecting about. And then with the smallholder farmers in the rural communities too, there are so many ways that we can provide support to them. So we started writing stories that relates to their needs and how we can empower them, like giving them trainings on capacity building so that on market or rent issues. So that's what currently we're doing in Ghana here. We're projecting the stories of smallholder farmers, linking them to investors and linking investors to opportunities that exist in the rural areas that they can invest in. Yep.
That's really interesting. And Lisa, do you want to add something? You were talking about connectivity and data and the accuracy of that data, both in the context of what you wanted to say, but also in the context of what we've just been talking about. So one of the important things for inward investment is accurate data about the land's potential or how a food system operates. Could you make some comment from an African perspective, from a South African point of view?
Yeah, sure. So just talking about connectivity, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Sometimes it's a bit spotty, this side of the world. I'm so glad to hear what Abbas is saying. It really speaks to a large part of the challenges we have with communicating effectively with many farmers who are either still at the beginning of their career, small scale, and what is newly been dubbed in our country at least, the missing middle farmer. So these are the guys who've been farming for a number of years, but they're not quite there yet where they can sustain themselves commercially throughout the year necessarily. So they might have a second job or a second stream of income. And the way we responsibly support them with information means we also need to have access to very good information. Unfortunately, we have this counter, and I think this is an issue all over the world, where social media, and for all the good it's brought, it has also brought some challenges in the media, where we are a source of good, responsible, trustworthy information, but on Facebook and WhatsApp especially, we find many times that farmers themselves are the source of misinformation that might be based on fact for them, but it is not necessarily a truth. And it's been a huge challenge. And this ranges from political views that has a direct influence on what happens in agriculture. We've got an unfortunate issue with violence in the country, but also in how they accept help or information from the government. They are mistrustful of government many times. They are mistrustful of each other because we've got a population with different cultures, different languages, and on social media, this distrust is further fueled, and it's quite horrific sometimes what people can get up to on social media. So for me, this connectivity issue is unfortunately also connected to your financial status. Where many of our farmers, and this is anybody from a rural farmer with 2 chickens and one cow, to your largest commercial farmers, will be on a platform like Facebook. But not all of them will have access to linking up with a podcast on improving your technical craftsmanship in agriculture. Not all of them will have enough data to even listen to or look at a 2-minute video. So we have to rethink as media how we actually access these markets and provide them with good information, and not just pander to the commercial farmer. Although it's a very big market for us, it is definitely not in numbers. So we might have in South Africa, there's an estimate of about 2 million subsistence farmers. But when we look at what we will dub a commercial farmer, it is around about 70,000, depending on who you ask. And that discrepancy in numbers means also that there's a huge discrepancy in connectivity. Can they access information that we publish now online? Can they even afford a magazine? So these are issues that we really have to look at to service everybody in agriculture. And I think it might be a little bit different from other countries, but we all have, to some extent, we have to overcome this. The other thing with connectivity is really not all areas have access to internet or good internet connection, including where I'm sitting now in Pretoria. I constantly get this message for unstable connection. So imagine you sit in rural South Africa. That just makes it totally impossible to log onto a webinar and listen for an hour to somebody. The cost of data here is also excessive. It's making me broke. So imagine somebody who is a subsistence farmer. who really live from day to day and what they can get in. I would like to see in media, and I'm talking a long time now, but I would like to see in media that either governments or big business support the free access of this kind of information through their platforms, so that no data costs are involved. But I think that is still a long way to go, and people are still making too much money for them to let go of that one for now. But yeah, that's my contribution. I think in my country, and this might be the case for the rest of the continent, connectivity, the accessibility of online information, including webinars and podcasts and things like that, as well as the affordability of it, is a huge challenge, and we have to work around that in this time.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I mean, connectivity the world over is an issue, and it's highlighted its importance now more than ever. I was just going to say that there might be a few people who'd like to comment on this, but I've just posted in the chat an interesting interview from yesterday with Dr. David Nabarro, who's been, he's the World Health Organization Special Envoy, but he's also been involved in, I think, a think tank looking at food systems for the future. But what he was saying is that he sees that sustainable food systems are more likely to emerge from emerging and developing economies than they are from developed economies, because there's more work to be done and the supply chains are simpler. I just wondered if anybody had any comment on that point. No? Not to worry. Let's change the tack slightly. So we've got Damien on the line, and Damien posted in the chat saying about what disruption has been affected has been minimal in Ireland. And I think where you've got a country that is very focused on primary agriculture, it's been very much business as usual, and I think Ireland's a really good example of that. Damien, could you just fill us in on what's been happening with you and expand on the point that you've raised in the chat? No? Well, I'm going to go to, I think, Melanie, are you still having a problem with your connectivity? Because there's two interesting things that you've said about, one is a very specific sector, which is potatoes, which is very important to you in Belgium, but also in the Netherlands. There's been quite a big impact from food service not taking produce. And I wondered if you wanted to make a comment on that. Not doing very well here. Does anybody want to say anything?
Jane, yeah, just on that point, you know, we at South Africa learned an important lesson during the start of COVID when our informal markets were shut down. We've got a lot of street traders that sell their vegetables on the sides of the roads to the, you know, to the passing public. People are using public.
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, sorry. And we actually found, and when we went into lockdown, all of those people were booted off the streets. So suddenly that market wasn't trading anymore, and we found that a lot of the farmers actually went out of business purely because they had solely been relying on that informal market. And I think a lot of us really underestimated how much we were actually reliant on that market. And it's not just the formal markets and sending to supermarkets, but it was those transactions that were happening on the streets that were absolutely vital. I spoke to a lot of farmers who, especially emerging farmers, who are just, you know, smallish farmers who they're not really connected to the value chain yet. So they've got a decent sized operation, but they don't have the connections to get into the big supermarkets. So what they end up doing is they sell to the hawkers. So a guy would come along with a pickup truck load the whole thing full of tomatoes and then sell it to the ladies next to the side of the road, and they sell it to the passers-by. And those guys went completely out of market because they just didn't have a market anymore. So that was a very big lesson that we learned. And just on your point regarding inputs and developed versus undeveloped countries, in South Africa, because inputs are so expensive, well, across Africa, you know, inputs are expensive, and you've got your subsistence farmers. Most of them are actually farming far more organically than what your bigger farmers are. And a lot of the training programs we have here are actually looking at farmers who are showing them systems to use where they don't need chemicals, where they are, for instance, taking onion skins and chucking a whole bunch of onion skins into buckets of water and using that water to throw over the plants to chase the bugs and the aphids away. So we're definitely, it seems like a backward way of farming, but it is somehow actually a far better way of producing food than the larger farmers do with all the expensive inputs.
Yeah, that's so true, Lindy. And I hadn't really thought about that, but that informality that happens, but also the cost of production is a massive part of how big business can produce cheaply. But it doesn't equal sustainable food supply systems, which is what this guy was saying. Yes. And what the other point that is raised, which has come up a number of times on this call, but you've raised the point indirectly about local, and you're talking about hyper local. So not just local food production as we get in some of the Western countries in Europe, where people drive maybe 10 miles to go to their preferred farm shop. You're talking about passing walking trade that's paying with cash, and that informal market is really important in your countries, in Africa, but also it's part of society and part of your culture.
Yes, it is. And because we see, so many of of the people here with the different income groups, and it's especially the lower income groups that are making use of the hawkers on the side of the road, and also within the townships themselves. A lot of people have huge businesses where they just, like I said, get in a pickup truck full of tomatoes, repackaging it and selling it again. And there's a huge number of people that are employed in what seems to be a very informal, sort of chaotic, jumbled setting, but that we're now starting to realize actually isn't. It's quite an organized sector, and they're playing by their own rules, but they're providing a lot of jobs and they're providing food security.
Yeah, fascinating. That's a really, really important insight. Damien, I'll come back to you in a minute, but one point that came up on another podcast I was listening to, I've been consuming so many podcasts over lockdown. It's made me more informed, I think, than I've ever been. But one of the comments that came up on the World Service does a great program called The Food Chain. And they were talking about wet markets in the Middle East and China particularly, and just how it touches on what you've just said, Lindy, which is just how important those markets are to the local economy, to the local culture, and that they are, as WHO and some international players are saying, that there's a call for these markets to be closed down because it's where COVID originated from. Now, for countries that use these wet markets, it's like closing down our supermarkets in Britain. It just couldn't happen without hugely impacting the people that use them. Would anybody like to comment on that? No? Damien, I'm going to come back to you. So you're a country, so give us some context. You're a country that's very reliant on primary production, and your trade has been impacted by COVID, but it's been very much business as usual from a production point of view. Could you just give us some comment on what's been happening at primary production level, but also within your supply chains in Ireland? Can't hear you. We still can't hear you. Are you swearing in Irish? Yeah. There you go.
Okay, that's better. Sorry,
Not
take
yet.
out the headphones. Just I have to move on to the mobile from the laptop. Yeah, hello everybody. We had this discussion a few weeks ago, Jane, about the situation here. I mean, you know, as an island nation, we're very dependent on food exports. So the supply chain wasn't necessarily really badly hit because we had the EU Green Lanes initiative early on, which didn't cause an awful lot of disruption to exports, you know, of dairy and beef, particularly out of this country. You know, at a macro level, of course, we export 14 billion euros worth of food and drink from the Republic of Ireland every year. 80–90% of our beef and dairy is for export. So as an island nation, we're very dependent on global trade. And the big worry in the future is as countries reassess their supply chain mechanisms in light of what happened with PPE and medical supplies, you know, maybe it's time for a rethink in terms of food supply as well. So you know, the Irish agri-food sector is a little bit nervous about that, but that's all down the road. But at a micro level, I was making the point earlier that at the very beginning of the pandemic, on our radio program, we found that the biggest story wasn't necessarily anything to do with primary production. I mean, you know, the restrictions and social distancing is something farmers and isolation are very used to, and you know, it was business as usual on farms. You know, there were aspects obviously of milk deliveries and milk collection which changed in regards to social distancing, vet visits, AI, all of that. They all impacted, but not hugely. Mart sales obviously stopped. That was a problem. Some of them went online, but in general, primary production continued. The problem we found was with a lot of the you know, if you want to call them the further up the food chain in terms of, you know, artisan food producers, of which there will be quite a lot of small businesses, some of them attached to primary farming, vegetable growers and wholesalers. They faced a massive disruption overnight with the closure of food outlets and restaurants, which was the lifeblood, in some cases 100% of their business. But they became very innovative. Give you one example: Cashel Blue cheese, which is you know, a very popular, well-known brand from County Tipperary. It's an artisan cheese, blue cheese, which is exported around the world, and I'm sure you're aware of it yourself, Jay. But it's a very successful company. But almost overnight, their business just almost, you know, collapsed because of the closure, because of restaurants in particular, because that's where they were selling a lot of their product. But what they did, and cheesemakers in particular in Ireland, is they clubbed together and they marketed themselves online, and people did respond. I mean, you know, consumers and the public in general went back to basics in terms of supporting local and supporting local food producers like this. And many of them have been able to survive as a result. And in the case of Cashel Blue, they've not only clubbed together, we'll say, with other cheese producers to try and promote themselves, but with other local, you know, food producers, you know. So you could order online a €100 food box, which included, you know, cheese, included fresh vegetables, included apple juice, that all made in a geographical area. So, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, as they say, and that is what has happened there. And the other problem, obviously, as well, is McDonald's, for example, with the closure of McDonald's and the other fast food outlets. You know, Irish beef producers, a lot of Irish beef is bought by McDonald's. I think on the continent, something like 20% of beef burgers eaten in McDonald's restaurants are from Irish farms. So when they shut down, that had a trigger and a knock-on, a tremor right down right up to to the beef farmers who are already struggling and already under pressure. But thankfully that has reopened. So yeah, I just think it's a very interesting point that primary production did continue to work along through the various phases and the problems early on over the last 3 or 4 months. And we were worried about peak milk, what impact that would have if there was a problem in one of the dairy processing facilities. What would happen if Glanbia had to shut down a milk processing plant? What would happen to all the excess milk that was coming up, particularly at the end of April and May? Thankfully, we've got across peak milk without any problems. There was obviously the downside, and I'll finish on this. The only negative, I suppose, story related to farming and food production and what was in relation to the meat plants. And obviously they were seen as an essential business. They continued business as normal, but obviously by its very process in a meat plant where you have so many people gathered, it's a very labor intensive business. And it went against everything that I suppose the rest of us in society were doing to try and beat COVID, which was social distancing. And that's why we've had quite a number of clusters in meat plants and maybe 1,000 cases or more at this stage in meat plants, because obviously staff, a lot of them foreign nationals who would be living together, family members living in accommodation all together, traveling to work together, working beside each other. So in the early days, obviously, before proper PPE was installed into a lot of the meat plants, the cases multiplied. And this was very much a negative. The meat processors got it really in the eye from the general public, from public discourse, that they didn't care about their workers. But some of them did work very, very hard to put in screens and give their staff the PPE required and all of that. So that was the only negative story associated with agriculture. Back to you, Jane.
Thank you, Damien. The meat sector, I mean, I know dairy's been affected globally, but the meat sector is just been the focus of attention all over the world. And I had the editor of The Grocer on the phone yesterday saying to me, Jane, I need to get under the skin of this story. Why is it happening? We need we need the meat trade to talk to us about the why, not just the what. So it's come up a couple of times, and Elaine, you put something in the chat about the US meat market. I just wondered if anybody could shed some light on what they think have been the issues and whether anybody's got under the skin of it. And also, Elaine, for an update on what's happening in the US with your meat plants, because that's been very publicly communicated globally.
Yeah, we continue to have growing in some of these big processing plants. And so it's not just beef. It's, we're seeing it in beef, we're seeing it in poultry, we're seeing it in other places. And, a part of it is everything's become so political here in the US too, where some areas, they've really opened up, a lot of the regulations too. So even though it was essential services in agriculture in a lot of areas, I think there's other things that are now contributing to maybe growing in some of the counties or regions of the country. But I think it's starting to draw attention when you start seeing different places in the Midwest where the population isn't great, but they've suddenly become the hot spots of the country for growing numbers of cases. And then people go, what's going on? And then they see they have a meat processing plant. And I think it's people that maybe didn't know what the supply chain was like. They're learning what it's like and how big an impact it can have when you have thousands of workers that are working in these plants. And when you start having thousands of cases in those plants, and it starts spreading into the community too. I know I was talking to an intern that we have down in Arkansas, and one of the things that she said to me was, I'm in the middle of, the chicken capital of the country in Arkansas, and we have a growing number of cases of workers with the COVID-19. I mean, we were trying to cover it in different ways, and it was kind of hard. We're trying to do it from home, but one of our staff actually went to Iowa, I guess it was about a week and a half ago, to one of these hot spots and trying to see, how is it affecting the whole community. He was very aware that he could catch it. He went and got tested, I think, the next day, and he's going to be, kind of still keeping an eye on it for the next 2 weeks. But one of the things that he found was when you go into that community, how people were not social distancing, how people were not wearing masks, and you start thinking about, even though it's in the meat processing plant, the rest of the community still is not changing maybe what they're doing. I know as us being an ag publication, we were trying to figure out how to keep doing our regular jobs as well as covering COVID. So when we heard with dairy, when they had to be dumping milk in fields, we were trying to think of different angles, including what can you do when you have to dump your milk into fields? How does this affect the soil? How does you try to do that angle of it? With the meat, listening to some of the other speakers today when they're saying that the farmers are reaching out and maybe doing direct marketing to customers, that's an option only to a certain degree here. We had feedlots that were saying, yeah, if you want to come and get a quarter of beef, or you want to get, people trying to sell hogs, but you can't sell thousands of hogs a day that way. And some people were trying to buy some meat like that, and then soon all the little butcher shops were full and they couldn't do it that way either. So they ended up having to kill hogs, and then we were trying to, how do you cover, what do you do with killing these hogs and burying them, and what are the regulations? And so it was that part of it. And then you have, of course, a depression of the farmers, and there's a lot of different angles, but you can't cover that all the time. So then you have to go back to saying, okay, what other things are customers interested in? What are they working on right now? So you go back to doing your usual production type stories. I think another thing that was really important for us is covering the whole marketing end of it. Farmers need to understand why their prices were so wildly and so chaotically all over the place when they were frustrated. They had all this meat and yet the stores were empty here. We had to try to explain to them the international supply chain a bit more too, I think, and showing that even though it might still seem like business as usual in their communities, they're still seeing their neighbors. They're still, like I said, not doing the social distancing thing. What might be happening in other places in the world is still going to affect them at the farm level.
Yes, such a everything you've said is just so fascinating and important to hear. I wonder, one of the things that, going back to what Chris was saying about opportunities with mainstream media, I wonder whether one of the things that we should consciously think about, all of us, is, and perhaps again take some leadership on, is, where are the futures for big business agriculture and supply chains, and where is the opportunity for more sustainable local supply chains? And we're in a perfect position not only to pick up on what Abbas said about, advising inward investment into what land to buy to produce food, but also how food systems might operate. How do you think we as communicators and agricultural journalists could facilitate that discussion more publicly?
Hello.
Abbas?
Hello, Fermin.
Yes, I can.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yeah. This is Fermin.
Hi, Fermin. Yes, carry on from the Philippines.
Yes. Regarding this meat imports, meat trade, and everything, or even agriculture as a whole, in our country, we have a lot of, so to speak, surplus meat. Not because our local producers had overgrown their production, but from the consumer side, there was a dramatic drop in purchasing power. So over the last 6 months, we have a continuous inflow of meat imports, pork, beef all over the world, especially from Brazil, Europe, and North America. But the problem now is practically all our cold storage facilities are so full. and the withdrawal is so slow because most of these cold storage facilities, I would say about 85% cater to the food service industries, hotels and restaurants, the fast food chains, everything, all of these are practically down. So local producers, while they want to store their goods in cold storage facilities, have no place or space to store because a lot of these privately owned cold storage facilities had already been contracted to large clients. So indeed, it's not just about agriculture as production itself. You have to look at the whole supply chain. Our country and most of the agriculture policies that we have been adapting focus more on farm production, increasing production, but it's not market oriented. That's the problem here in our country now. So I think the bigger picture should be a balanced policy or agricultural investment, not just in the production side, but also in post-harvest facilities, up to the level where the produce, whether these are raw materials or intermediate products or finished products, had to go in an efficient way to the consumers or their end users. This is the challenge that maybe some of us local agricultural journalists had not been airing or ventilating as a part of public discourse. So there's really a need to bring these issues forward because, again, as I said, our agricultural policies had for the longest time been so focused on increasing production. It's not so much in increasing farmers' wealth or farmers' income. That's another thing. And of course, making those produce really affordable to the consumers. These are the challenges that had to be highlighted and to be really addressed. And our role here as agricultural journalists are really far more significant because you look at the post-COVID scenario, I think the first primary thing that people would really talk about is about food, about survival. Are food being produced, whether coming from abroad or locally produced, affordable to ordinary consumers? If it's not, then maybe it's a problem of supply chain, food systems, inefficient food systems, or lack of agri-investments in post-harvest facilities, on storage, on packaging. So that's at least how I see it here in our country.
That's really
Back to you,
interesting.
Jane.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think probably a lot of countries, wherever we are in the world, we will see where the lack of investment has had an impact either on small farming businesses or supply chains, and it's become so apparent with COVID-19 just where those vulnerabilities are. I was going to go to Patrice on the Ivory Coast. Patrice, you made a point about raw materials in your country and the trading of raw materials. Do you want to say any more on that? No? Okay, I'm going to switch to Chris and a couple of people, Addy as well. Maybe go to Addy first. You've been talking about the opportunities, and both of you have been getting quite excited about the potential opportunities for agricultural journalists, but also, Addy, maybe for agricultural journalists in creating other business opportunities. Addy, do you want to go first?
Yes, thanks, James. I think the quarantine give us so many opportunities to improve our activities, and the journalists obviously So we must create new products. We must create ourselves again and give our customers, our readers, our listeners new products. And we can, with the new technologies, do that. So I think it's not easy, but it's possible, okay? We must adapt to the new situation, to the new pandemic, to COVID-19. And maybe we can turn a different way from the communication. You know, there's the budgets of large companies linked to agriculture sector were previously allocated to events, can now be allocated to other types of marketing actions like webinars, like electronic media, and we really have many stories to tell. So we have a great opportunity now. I think that.
Yeah, I agree. Chris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just that some of the manufacturers that I've been talking to recently that should be at shows, they're reporting that their advertising budgets are sitting healthy, and they're ready to dispense that budget to get the news out about new products. It all depends on the seasons. We're going into a bad season for buying machinery and other agricultural equipment, but I think content writers may benefit from this going forward to get features done for the exhibitors or machinery manufacturer or whoever, to get the message to the customers, to the farmers via the media. There also will be opportunities for journalists like myself who should be reporting on the shows, but who have other plans to get that message to the end user as well. And as print and online media pick up again from the last 3 months, they need to link up with the consumer, with the manufacturers, with the farmers. And I think there's a huge role, crucial role that media will play, agri-media will play, not so much about the daily newspapers I talked about earlier, but agri-media in particular will play in the future going forward. And it's one that we shouldn't miss.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's really good interjection. I've had a comment from Gilles. He was asking if in the future there might be an opportunity for a translation to French. So Hugh, maybe that's something over to you for future comment. Does anybody want to make a point about the opportunities for journalism going forward? Because it's such an important topic, and we've all noticed that there are opportunities, but we probably need to be a bit more proactive on how we do that. Does anybody want to make a comment on that?
Hello.
Hi, Fermin.
I think for the last couple of months, people have been so used to working from home, working at home. And even businesses now are shifting to the digital space. I myself been involved in print and print journalism. I see a lesser interest now in people going to print because they want faster, quicker delivery of news, and all they have to do is open their internet. So I'm not sure, it's not just agri-journalism, whether you're a sports journalist, political journalist. I think you have to focus, or at least adjust your position, your role as a journalist into going to something digital, or probably a balance. If you are purely print, you have to increasingly shift to digital, but at least try to maintain a little print business. That's how I see it.
Yeah, that's a really key part, a really important point.
May I come in, Jane?
Mike, yes, fire away.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's I just wanted to mention that I also think it's a question about putting more focus on sufficiency. in everyday farming and journalism. We had the luck here in Finland that in the beginning of the crisis, the government made some very severe decisions about what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to. But the farmers were taken out as a special group, like nurses and doctors and so on, because they were seen to be important for the rest of society and for the food supply. And that was a great race also for the status of the farmers, and that made the rest of the media interested in the farmers as a group, also the mainstream media. And a fact is, in somehow we perhaps, the agri-media perhaps missed the beginning of that run, because we were so into our own circles still, so we jumped on a little bit later. But I think that we in the future would have to put more attention to the sufficiency of food, because that's just as important, because we also saw that when we have oversupply in some foods, mostly fresh foods delivered to restaurants and so on, then we also had a risk of undersupplying in many of these basic products. For instance, in Finland, because import would be much more difficult during COVID-19. And that, of course, raised the importance of a domestic production. So I think that we have some challenges here also as agriculture journalists in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Micke. Thank you, everybody, for being involved today and for all of your contributions. We will continue the e-Congress for the rest of the week. So look forward to seeing you all later in the week. And if you have any questions for Theo, Hugh, will you share his contact details with all of the participants?
Yes, there's been a few questions. As you say, we posted on the website. We'll get. I'm going to get hold of the chat, because there are a lot of good comments and questions, and I'll send that out by email afterwards, along with coordinates for Theo, if anybody wants to do some follow-up.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much, everybody, for all of your contributions. It's been a fascinating discussion, and yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you later in the week. And there's also, next week, there's a couple of other events. So I'm going to be hosting an AgriComms Zoom room with some young farmers from around the world, talking about what they think the future might be for young farmers post-COVID. And also, I know for ENAJ, there's going to be an event that Damien is pulling together at the moment, with some comment on the impact of drought, the future post-COVID, and a number of other topics. So they will be circulated. And Damien, if you're still on, which I don't think he is, but I think that will be made available for people outside the ENAJ network as well. So thank you ever so much, everybody. It's really great to see so many people participating. And it just shows the power of the IFAJ and all of the voices that we can hear and the different perspectives. And what it also brings back to me, all of the conversations I've had with global contacts, is just how similar the problems are. So we have a real opportunity, I think, now to demonstrate some leadership as communicators within our sector. So thank you ever so much, everybody, and see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
And thank you very much, Hugh, for all of your work.
Thank you, Jane.
As always.
Tomorrow, cross-border cooperation at 400 GMT.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.